Hi, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was here last year and really delighted that the Polish Institute for International Affairs invited me back here a second year to moderate. And I also, it's very poignant for me because I think it was about 25 years ago that I was part of about a dozen students at Yale University in a rapidly shrinking area known as Russian and East European Studies. And it was during the 1990s, the end of the 1990s, the peace dividend, there was falling interest in the area, but there were very good students there, including an Army officer that we always knew was going to go on to great things, and sure enough, Chris Cavoli did. I think I had less idea of what I was going to do with an East European Studies degree. But I think what united those students at the time was the idea that even as there was falling national security interest in the region, it was an area that we needed to stay involved in, that we needed to pay attention to. And I think the events of the past year, as unfortunate as they are, have reinforced that belief. I also really want to recommend the Polish Institute of International Affairs' latest publication, Point of No Return. This was my nighttime reading last night. Has a great collection of essays about the Ukraine conflict and beyond. I wanted to thank the panelists for being here and start off with a broad question that each of you can address, which is we're now over a year after the invasion. How has the security landscape in Europe changed, and how has it changed between different countries? It's obviously been transformative for some, but perhaps less so for others. And I'll let each address.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we are in Warsaw, and the security landscape in the perspective of Warsaw and the frontline countries who border to Russia or have been on the other side of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War has, I mean, dramatically changed. For them, it's obviously an existential war that Ukraine is fighting also on behalf of them. And then you have on the other side former Western European or still Western European countries who are wondering what the meaning of this war is for them and their own security. I mean, there's a lot of sympathy for Ukraine and compassion, and the images of Bucha have really shaken the conscience of the world, at least in Europe very much, in Germany certainly. But security-wise, I mean, it took a lot of time to realize that we are moving towards a new landscape, and relations with Russia are going to be dramatically different after this war and still starting from now. And this is a realization that took time. I think Germany on the last Sunday has really demonstrated that it is moving on with the visit of Zelensky, the Karlspreis in Aachen, and also the promise of new military support. But to me, the most interesting part of that was the promise to deliver 8 billion military aid worth 8 billion until 2032. So there's a long-term perspective for support of Ukraine, and I would say Germany has switched, clearly positioned itself on the side of Ukraine right now, and there's no way back for the foreseeable future towards a kind of idea of partnership with Russia. So this has changed, but each country is a bit different.
Thank you, Sharon, and good morning, everybody. First, some good news. Today, my latest book, The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is published. It is brilliant and very reasonably priced, and I fully recommend it. But I am not in the mood to be self-congratulatory. Yeah, the landscape may be changing, but when I'm in capitals, particularly in Western Europe, I don't think the right lessons are being drawn, i.e., I don't think the right lessons are being drawn in terms of the strategic ambition that we Europeans collectively require in the world into which we're moving, the order of European security going forward, the implications thereof, the technical lessons we're learning from the war about the nature of future war. Chris and his team with the Family of Plans are doing a great job. but whatever they produce can only work if it's grasped politically at the highest levels in our capitals. And I still see, when I go to London, for example, although there's been a significant increase in the UK defence budget, most of the defence investment is going towards the nuclear side, towards the maritime side, not so much more the army. And I also find a government that's wrestling between three camps, those like me who believe geopolitics is back and we have to invest in deterrence and defence, but also keep America strong where America needs to be strong to make the global community of democracies a valid deterrence globally. But also those who believe that they can return to some kind of globalization supply chain dream before the COVID pandemic with China. And those who are much more concerned about climate change and net zero. And what I'm not seeing is the creation of what I call complex strategy to understand how we manage all of those. So Ukraine is part of that. And as for the Bucha effect, I feel that many people in Western Europe, Balkans and other great tragedies around the world in recent years have become a bit inured to it. And so yes, they're very sad as it happens, but it's not driving policy in the way that it should. And I think, you know, the question I'd put to my leaders, and I'm in London next week with ministers, is what will it take for we Western Europeans to really grip the pace, the scale, and the extent of transformation which we need to grip if we are to be credible in our role as defenders of democracy and deterrers of autocracy?
I think we are similarly, that we are in a strategic transformative moment for European security architecture. But this is being felt differently across Europe. Of course, for the Eastern flank countries, especially for Poland, for the Baltic states, but also partly for the Nordic states, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has serious implications. And it's existential, since from our perspective, this is only the first, or this might be only the first step of Russia in the quest of undermining European security architecture as we have known that after post-Cold War. And I'm not sure, similarly, that this is widely understood, especially in Western Europe. And when talking about Russian goals, I always try to remind people of what Russia is publicly saying and what Russia has publicly presented to the US and to NATO in December 2021, the two draft treaties in which Russia has clearly stated its goals. Generally speaking, the first one is, of course, subordinating Ukraine and putting Ukraine into the Russian spheres of influence. But the second goal is to make Central Eastern Europe a security void, getting rid of US and NATO military infrastructure and presence, making the region prone to Russian interest and pressure. And the third goal is to push out the US out of Europe, to make Europe in general susceptible to Russian interests, goals, and foreign security and economic policy. And if Russia will not be stopped in Ukraine, Russia will go further. And this is a clear understanding here on the eastern flank. And therefore, the actions the countries of the eastern flank are taking are answer to the urgency of the situation. And this means huge investments in own national defense. This means increasing resilience of the societies. This means more regional cooperation. And this means also activism and active policies towards the US and towards Western Europe to convince our partners and allies that the situation is grave, that the urgency of action action needs it should be understood widely, and on part of the Western Europe, I think many still does not want to understand the urgency of the situation and the seriousness of the situation, and we can clearly see on the attitudes and actions towards helping Ukraine militarily. We see this on Western attitudes on where Ukraine should be in the European security architecture after the end of this war, and we see this with regard to Western investment and the willingness to invest in own armed forces. But on the other hand, I see also positive signs, and much has moved in Western Europe and the institutions. As the NATO and the EU, and we have heard in the last panel that the NATO is structurally changing, that the collective defense is the priority, and now this is the time to invest in own defenses and to help Ukraine as much as possible.
I'm going to come at this from an Australian perspective. Shortly before the war began in 2022, I was coming back from Brisbane, and the discussion up until that point was very much, well, the Russians wouldn't dare do it. They wouldn't go into Ukraine, and of course they did. And I think the key thing that I take forward over 12 months later, after the Russian invasion, is this has been a huge blow to the confidence of many in liberal democracies that somehow major power war is a thing of the past. Major power war is here, and it's here now. And it's not just about Russia in Europe, it's about China in the Indo-Pacific. And it's about a prolonged, decades-long period of strategic competition and the risk of major power conflict between autocracies on the one hand and liberal democracies on the other. We have a determination on the part of the autocracies, the authoritarian states, to essentially bury the liberal democracies and to end liberal democracy as a system in the international arena. They want a world by 2123 that is safe for authoritarianism. So what we see now with Ukraine is the beginning of that process. And we see the same process occurring very much in the Indo-Pacific in relation to Taiwan. And so we're having to shift gears in terms of how we deal with that prolonged period of strategic competition, how we deal with the risk of major power war that could include potentially the use of nuclear weapons, but it will certainly potentially include major power use of force like we're seeing in Ukraine, where we need to actually think about how we shift our societies and our industrial processes and our manufacturing capabilities and our approach to warfare away from short, sharp, low-intensity conflicts to prolonged, protracted war between major powers. And I think from a European perspective, from my vantage point in Canberra, there's an awful lot of actors and commentators who get it and who understand the challenge and the inflection point in history that we're in. But there's still too many people who are thinking, well, surely if we can just get a peace process going, if we can get a negotiation going, that will solve it and we can go back to where we were before. There's no going back. We're in this for the long haul. And we better get ready for it. And we better basically settle in to try and defend liberal democracy, because it is under challenge across all borders, not just in Europe, but also in the Indo-Pacific.
Perhaps picking up on that point in the long haul, what does Ukrainian victory look like? And does it look like for different countries? There certainly have been hints at different times from the US that they would like to see some sort of negotiations after the counteroffensive. But in the eyes of the different allies, what does Ukrainian victory look like? Does it look like when there's an agreement for fighting to end, when Ukraine retakes pre-1914 territory? What might it look like for different countries?
I think there's now an agreement between Washington, Paris, Berlin, London, probably, that there will be an offensive, and this offensive is meant to put Ukraine in a good position for negotiations. So I think the perspective now is negotiations, and I also assume that Washington, the Biden administration, would be happy if this kind of wouldn't spill over into election year, next year, presidential elections. I think at the moment everybody's waiting what's going to happen in Ukraine, and the battlefield will shape what comes after. But the broader idea is that at some point there will be negotiations. It's also what we hear from Macron. There's now a lot of talk about involving the Chinese to put pressure on Russia. So yes, now it's Ukraine offensive and then negotiations. I pretty much doubt that this is how it's going to look like. I mean, we hear from the military experts that nobody really knows how this offensive is going to, turn out and what the result will be. And I don't think that the Russian side is ready to negotiate whatever is going to happen in the next weeks or months. So for Putin, this is a war that has started in 2014, and we're just in a new chapter, and this is the long protected war that you talked about, and it's probably not going to be over this year, next year, because it's about Russian aspirations. And Justyna just laid these aspirations out. Putin has clearly talked about it. So this is just one chapter in a very long fight for order, international order, liberal order versus autocracy, however you can call it, great power competition. But it's all about the challenge from Russia and China to the existing international order. So this is just going to be one chapter, and we really need to be prepared for the longer fight. And I think this is dawning in Western Europe as well, so that there's no way back to I wouldn't say business as usual, but to a relationship with Russia which is based on a mutual understanding about the contours of European peace order. This is not going to happen, not this year, not next year. So we will see potentially tactical concessions on the Russian side in order to ease the Western pressure, sanctions, military pressure, support for Ukraine. But I think support for Ukraine is now pretty solid, also in Western Europe. There's a lot of sympathy. In my country, there are many Ukrainians, civil society, the body politics has very much moved behind Ukraine. So I think we are moving towards a longer-term readiness for confrontation, which is, not what we wanted, but what we get from the Russian side. There's a realization that there's no way to get back. And so I think this short-term talk about, this year and peace negotiations, it's based on the illusion that Russia may understand that the war didn't go well and that they have to rebuild relations with the West. I think this is still part of the old mindset that is going to be taken over by events.
So you think the negotiations are pointless at this stage after the counteroffensive?
We don't know how this offensive will play out and what's going to happen in Russia, but I think with Putin wants to dominate the region, and this is an imperial war or an imperialist war, and it's not going to stop as long as Putin is in power. And the longer he's in power and the longer this war continues, the more he will bring Russia behind in this kind of warrior mood. And this is the biggest danger for us. And that's why also Ukraine is so crucial for us to teach Russia the lesson that we don't accept your neo-imperial vision of yourself, and this has to be underlined, and I think this is why we support Ukraine every day. Russia needs borders, and we have to make Russia understand that we're living in a Europe of nation states and secure borders, and this struggle will continue.
Let's cut to the quick here. Russia has war aims. We need war aims. Cut all this theory of victory nonsense. Our war aims, because the Russians think they're at war with us, are a return of Ukraine to its 1991 borders. That's it. Whatever it takes. At the Vilnius summit, given it's taking place in Vilnius, there'll be lots of complicated talk in the declaration about membership action plans and enhanced opportunity partnerships. Ukraine should be offered eventual membership, accelerated membership. It'll take some time, but it should happen. But the fundamental thing I want at that summit is a clear statement from the allies of what our war aims are, so that Moscow is under no illusion that we will do whatever it takes for however long it takes to achieve that objective. This is going to be over several campaign seasons, there's no question of it, but this campaign season is the critical moment right now. We are Ukraine's strategic depth. We, this coalition of supporting countries. The level of support that we give Ukraine now, whether it's in capabilities, capacity, training, political support, intelligence, or whatever, this will dictate the extent to which the Ukrainians can make progress towards that goal that we've set. So no illusion in Moscow's mind about our commitment to that goal. Do I sense it's going to happen? No. I think there's still too much prevarication in too many countries, and such a clear statement of intent would, I believe, have a huge impact, not just on the Ukrainians who are fighting this proxy war on our behalf, but also on the Russians. And it's vital that the Russians right now understand that resolve.
I would put the question differently, because it's not the question about what is the Ukrainian victory, but it is the question about how to guarantee peace in Europe in the long term. And that should be the question that we should put to ourselves and that we should answer. And this is, of course, that means, of course, Ukraine coming back to borders from 1991, but this is also Ukraine becoming NATO and EU members. Because we cannot allow ourselves to let Ukraine and other countries to stay in the gray zones, and we cannot, because gray zones will mean further attempts of Russian neo-imperial ambitions, Russian expansions. So I think, first of all, we should understand that we should draw a clear border between Russia and the West, and state that the Ukraine should be a member of the West. Ukraine has deserved that. That might be a longer way, but Ukraine should be given credible path both in the EU and in NATO to both organizations.
Yeah, I think we're all saying the same thing. Look, there can be no negotiations until Ukraine has retaken control of all its territory back to 1991 borders, and that includes Crimea. So we cannot permit a negotiated settlement process to basically give the Russians time to rebuild their capabilities, nor can we permit a negotiated peace settlement process to allow the Russians to hang on to illegally annexed territories. So the first point is there's got to be a complete Ukrainian victory, and we have to do everything we need to do for as long as it takes to ensure that the Ukrainians actually do retake their entirety of their territory, including Crimea. Second point, they have to be brought into NATO and the EU as fast as possible, much faster than the traditional process. So there needs to be something similar to Finland and hopefully Sweden that basically brings them in to ensure that they are covered under Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on all, and we have to take that responsibility seriously. And we have to make it clear to Moscow that any future attack on Ukraine as a NATO member would bring in a full military commitment by NATO. There can be no prevarication whatsoever in that regard. The third point is that we must keep Russia isolated politically and economically until they pay reparations, and ideally until Putin is in The Hague. Because if we allow Russia, or if we give in to the temptation to try and talk to the Russians again and bring them back into the system, then they will just see that as weakness and they'll exploit it. So these are really tough conditions. These are basically saying that we have to be in it for the long haul, and we have to do what we need to do to ensure Ukraine wins. And that victory has to be total, and it has to be long-lasting. There can't be any sort of quid pro quo here or uncertainty. We have to win.
So given what people have mentioned here about the path to NATO and the EU, it still appears that Ukraine's ascension to NATO would be that there is a lack of support among the members for that right now. Are there any sort of security guarantees? People have talked about different models. Is there any way that negotiations could take place and that Ukraine would feel comfortable that there's a security guarantee from the West, absent NATO membership, that would work?
So I think that this talk about security guarantees is a little bit, ridiculous, because if you are afraid of escalation with Russia now, imagine this war winds down and there are security guarantees for Ukraine, and next time Russia attacks, you think they all will have disappeared? Russia will still have nuclear weapons, and there will be still a lot of concern in the Chancellery, in the Elysee, and in the White House about a major war with Russia. This is not going to go away. And I think we have to factor this in always. It's a main driver of policy in the West. So written security guarantees will, and there's no way that they will be something different from the Budapest Memorandum if it's just written security guarantees. Of course, there's the Rasmus Security Compact, which basically means everything without Article 5. Bringing Ukraine to the level of a NATO member state and doing exercises and demonstrating the willingness to support Ukraine in its defense. But I think the dividing line is it's our war or it's not our war once Russia attacks. And we are in the West, I think the view is it should not be our war. So it can't be NATO right now, but of course, Ukraine should get anything it needs to defend itself, to deter Russia credibly. Then we talk about Israel and so on and so on. So yes, NATO would be ideal, but I'm not sure whether the US is there, and I'm not sure whether the Biden administration wants to bring this up in an election year. After Trump has just made in his CNN interview, just told everybody that he can end this war in 24 hours, and that this is an issue of burden sharing with the Europeans. So I'm not sure whether the Biden administration wants to make Ukraine a major contested issue in the American election year. So I think we should aim for NATO, but we should also be very, put a lot of pressure on policymakers to draw up long-term plans for military support for Ukraine. Then whether it's NATO or not, we'll still have to deliver weapons and training to Ukraine. And I think the plans should start now also to signal to Russia that this is about a long-term commitment for Ukraine and that we are determined to make sure that Russia can't attack again, whatever way it will be. Of course, there will be in Vilnius, the Bucharest formula will be repeated, maybe improved, Bucharest plus. But I think at the same time, we should not only focus on NATO and guarantees, but also on material improvement and long-term planning for Ukraine. If there is a plan that is very visible, communicated publicly, the Russian side will understand that we are in for the long haul and not just supporting Ukraine until this war is over, and then there is a kind of fake peace or whatever, so that their calculations, that we understand what they want and that we are ready to push back against that.
Look, there can be no effective policy without risk. And that is the curse of Western Europe in particular, risk aversion. That somehow this can be managed without risk. It can't. But at the same time, what are we afraid of? Russia is not going to go to nuclear war with us because it would be nuclear suicide. Their conventional capabilities are rubbish. And they've revealed that to the world, even the Chinese, who, by the way, are contemptuous of the Russians, even though they instrumentalize them for their own grand strategic purposes, understand that. We have the Russians on the back foot. We need to drive home that message. Now, I have the honor of chairing a group of 70 senior practitioners, policymakers, mainly retired. We call ourselves the Jurassic Park of grand strategy, called the Alphen Group. And we're launching a major Ukraine strategy at the European Parliament on June the 6th, D-Day. And in there, we spent a lot of time as part of the annexes looking at mutual commitments of security with Ukraine in the interim period before membership, but also redesigning the membership action plan, specifically for Ukraine to gain NATO membership rapidly, but in the interim to follow up the work of my colleagues Ian Brzezinski and Sandy Vershbow on a defense and deterrence partnership as part of the transition to membership. And it's vital that we make the various instruments available to us across diplomatic, information, military, and economic. We clearly establish them now. We clearly establish a roadmap, because that is part of deterring Russia from going any further. And we need to have that clarity of messaging, both to ourselves and indeed to the Russians, that that is our intent. Anything less will simply spin this war out. Russia started this war on their terms. We will end the war on our terms. And by the way, for those who say that Russia was not going to invade Ukraine, I was warning in September 2022 onwards, the invasion was coming. And it was amazing how many people who now said, yes, they always thought it was coming, but didn't, are now somehow reinventing themselves, because we were in denial. So risk and denial have been our curse. That's our problem. We have to overcome it. Once we overcome risk and denial, then I'm convinced we will shorten this war which the Ukrainians are fighting on our behalf.
Personally, I do not believe in credible security guarantees other than NATO membership, whether it's conventional and nuclear dimension. If we do not draw a clear line between the West and Russia, Russia will not cease its attempts to conquer Ukraine, as it perceives Ukraine as key in its neo-imperial agenda and key with regard to domestic developments in Russia. So if there will be no NATO membership and EU membership of Ukraine in the EU, if the West will not continue the strategy of isolation of Russia, if it will not be ready to contribute to Russian defeat, I think we should prepare ourselves for long-term conflict, crisis, war in Eastern neighborhood, and possibly also Russian provocations or aggressions against NATO eastern flank and hybrid warfare against Europe and the West in general. I also don't believe in security guarantees because they basically imply that the country that would give security guarantees to Ukraine would step into the war if Russia would attack Ukraine again. And I think this is what the main actors and our main allies are trying to avoid now. I do believe, however, that knowing that there is no consensus right now on on NATO membership for Ukraine, I think that step by step we can go into this direction. And NATO summit in Vilnius should be the first step in the strategy. The strategy should base on mid and long-term concept of arming Ukraine beyond the current military deliveries. It should be based on increasing political and military cooperation between NATO and Ukraine. And further, it should be based on strategy on how to win this war and not on how to lead to a kind of truce, because that will be only temporary. The strategy should be based on isolating Russia and understanding that Russia does not want a peace with us. Hence, I hope there will be a growing understanding in the West of that. And we might go into this direction with smaller steps if we are now not united in our strategy.
Look, I think we've all seen that the Budapest memorandum was not worth the paper it was written on. So I think that we need to avoid making the same mistake again with just further security guarantees. It needs to be full NATO membership with Article 5 protection and everything that goes with that. If Russia were to attack a NATO state, say the Baltic states or Poland, then NATO would respond under Article 5. Ukraine needs to have the same security, and it needs to happen fast as possible in terms of Ukraine achieving its victory and then being brought in to NATO. So I think anything less than NATO Article 5 is just inviting another war. We can't afford to make that mistake again. We need to have Ukraine as a full NATO member under Article 5 and a full member of the EU as fast as possible. That's the way to avoid a future war.
Thank you. Let's talk about the role of China for a moment. We went from just a little bit ago of the U.S. saying that China was on the verge of sending lethal assistance to Russia to then sort of the peace proposal or the position paper, and then the U.S. saying, well, maybe there could be some role. What do you see as China's role in this conflict?
I think basically for China, Russia is useful. I would call it even a useful idiot, because this war and the Russian behavior tries to undermine the liberal international order, or however you want to call this order. And so they are very useful because China wants, someone said climate change in international relations, so they want a different order, and they go out, they say this publicly, and the US is the problem on the path towards that Chinese-centered order. Von der Leyen, thankfully, has laid this out, Commission President, in her de-risking speech. So I think the picture is pretty clear what China wants. And now they try tactically to play with the Russian war in order to achieve other goals. I think one main goal is to split the transatlantic alliance. So playing now with aspirations for peace in Europe, responding positively to Scholz or Macron whenever they go with a big business delegation to Beijing. then it's easy for the Chinese side to give them some nice words about peace in Ukraine, and so they can go home and say, well, look, the Chinese are playing a constructive role. I think this is a trap, and I'm not sure whether Western European leaders all are aware of this trap. The Chinese want to use, I mean, they want Russia to be weaker than China, certainly, but not too weak, because they can't stand alone against the US and its allies. So to have Russia give them a much bigger, kind of better position, and I think this war presents them with the opportunity to present China as peaceful country, constructive player on the international scene. So that's very welcome to China. And well, there is now a lot of activity with just the Chinese envoy in Ukraine. I think the US position is, well, let's see, and Blinken said this is in an interview to the Washington Post, let's see if they play, if they move things in the right direction, why not? So the US doesn't want to be seen as an obstacle of bringing China in. And the argument that I see is that China is the only country that has a certain leverage on Russia. So if the Russians sign up to something and the Chinese are on board, it's much harder for the Russians to break this new, I don't know, contract or however you want to call it, agreement, and then frustrate the Chinese who were in the process. But I think this all is based on the view that there's going to be, grand-scale peace negotiations anytime soon, and I think this is just not the scenario we're moving towards. So China wants to use this for its own goals. I think there's no, why not? And Ukraine, Zelensky pretty much is interested in this China link. So if we bring them in, if we accept their presence in those diplomatic negotiations, but without being naive, without giving them the opportunity to play the Europeans and to split the transatlantic alliance over that. So why not? But I personally doubt that the Chinese really want to get their hands dirty and play spend a lot of capital in getting this war to be ended. I think this is based on a wrong analysis of what China wants and the broader Chinese ambitions and the Russian-Chinese quasi-alliance, which has been laid out in February 2022, just before the war. So it's all on paper, it's all on record, and yeah, they can participate, but in a framework that has been set by Ukraine, by the Europeans, and inside the transatlantic alliance.
The Chinese are coercion freaks. I mean, any autocracy with power, they just can't help it. I mean, when I left Oxford many, many years ago, I was sent to Hong Kong. And my apologies to the Yanks in the room for what I'm about to say. But I attended a dinner with the then governor of Hong Kong, who was an old-fashioned British diplomat. And we had Speck with us. And we had 3,000 Gurkhas and Royal Marines in the new territories, facing 800,000 PLA. And Speck said to the governor, he said, well, Governor, what will you do in the event of a Chinese incursion into Hong Kong? And the governor sat back and he said, well, probably a withdrawal. And then kept on eating. And after about 30 seconds of silence, Speck said, and your second contingency? He said, oh, an extremely rapid withdrawal. And the reason that he said that was because we actually knew they weren't going to do anything, because they were laundering money through Hong Kong like mad. The Han Chinese culture of leadership is manipulation, is instrumentalization. And that's what they're doing to the Russians right now. They are instrumentalizing Russia to make life hard for America. And that is where the linkage between what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in the Taiwan Strait becomes clear. Because Beijing's wet dream, if they do attempt an invasion of Taiwan, by the way, the distance from Taiwan, from mainland China to Taiwan, that the closest point is exactly the same as that between southern England and Normandy. It's 110 nautical miles. It took the Allies 4 major maritime amphibious operations to get that right. And we were blue water navies, the Royal Navy, the US Navy. We knew this stuff, but we still had to practice Torch, Husky, Avalanche, and Dieppe was a disaster beforehand. We learned the lesson. Chinese have never done this, so I'm not that immediately concerned about an invasion. But should they do it, the idea is to stretch the Americans thin the world over. And then the question becomes for us Europeans, given the Chinese instrumentalization of Russia, what do we Europeans do if the Americans find themselves fighting 3 theaters simultaneously? Well, by 2030, for once we Europeans have to mean what we said in the NATO strategic concept, in the military strategy of 2019, and indeed in the NATO Agenda 2030. By 2030, we Europeans need an allied, mobile, heavy, rapid reaction capability that can act as a high-end deterrent in and around Europe, even if the Americans are busy elsewhere. That's the single most cogent military message from what's happening in Ukraine. Am I seeing an ambition to achieve that? I'm seeing incremental hikes in military expenditure. I'm not seeing what I would call coordinated planning. In fact, if I had power, which probably wouldn't be a good thing, but never mind, I would give NATO's defense planners and say, guys, ladies and gentlemen, go off, come back with the optimal defense plan for NATO, work out how much it will cost, and then we'll work out how much we can afford, how we afford it. What we've got still is a culture in Europe of how much threat can we afford. You cannot build credible deterrence and defense going forward if your culture is built on how much threat can we afford. That's completely the wrong way around this. And given the changing, transformative, changing character of war, the nature of war will remain the same. But the changing character of war by 2035, 2040, I think we don't even begin to realize the scale of the challenge that we Europeans face, not only to maintain credible alliance, deterrence, and defense, but to ensure that we fully share the burdens with our American allies, given the growing pressures on their national security interest.
From my perspective, the conversation about China as a possible mediator is a bit detached from the war Russia wages against Ukraine, and is rather a conversation about Western approach to China. And especially biggest countries in Western Europe that do not agree with shaping the narrative and the policies in terms of great power competition, try to present China as an actor that can be and should be integrated and engaged in the crisis and conflict regulation within the existing international rules-based order. From my perspective, these are illusions of China playing a constructive role between Ukraine and Russia, where we clearly are in the situation where China sides with the fellow challenger of the regional and world order as we have it. So I perceive this is the attempt from Western Europeans to include China and engage China. And from the US, what we have all read in the media, I perceive it rather as a tactical maneuver of trying to dissuade China from supporting Russia militarily in Ukraine and trying to put China, or since it wants to present itself as a mediator, so this mediator role is and should be then linked with a kind of neutral war with regard to any party of this war.
Look, in terms of the Chinese peace plan, it's not talking about the Russians withdrawing from Ukraine and recognizing Ukraine's sovereignty to 1991 borders. So it's dead on arrival at that point. There should be no embracement of the Chinese peace plan until it accepts the fact that Ukraine's sovereignty at 1991 borders is sacrosanct, and it enforces Russia to do that. So we should not be, shall we say, having a dalliance with the Chinese in this regard. Secondly, we have to recognize that from Beijing's perspective, Russia is a useful vassal for Beijing, in the sense that they can use the war in Ukraine, they can use Russia to keep the Americans tied up in Europe, to keep Western military production sort of stretched, so that when the Chinese do make their move against Taiwan, potentially as early as the second half of this decade, but maybe later, we don't know. But when they do it, the Americans won't be as ready as they should be. So we should see through China's plans. And I'm sounding incredibly cynical about this, but I'm sorry. The Chinese objective here, their grand strategic objective, is to end US strategic primacy globally and to create a China century, and to essentially create a China dream of a rejuvenated China, the return of the Middle Kingdom with vassal states in the Indo-Pacific that pay tribute to Xi Jinping. That's what they want, okay? And there are ways to achieve that, and one of those ways is to keep the Ukraine war going, to keep the Americans and NATO tied up there so they don't have the means to prepare for a Taiwan contingency later this decade. And at the same time, Ukraine is a very useful learning experience for the PLA. They're learning a great deal on how the Americans and Western systems fight, what not to do in terms of how the Russians are doing things. They're gaining a great deal from this. So when the Chinese talk about peace plans, I'm sorry. I don't take them seriously because they are not genuine. And they have to be seen through that broader context of China's grand strategic ambition, which is a China century, a world safe for authoritarianism and democracy on the ash heap of history.
Great, thank you. Actually, I wanted to turn now to any questions from the audience. I think there are perhaps microphones.
I'm glad you could see something.
I can't.
Lucas.
Oh.
Lucas.
Great, please.
Stand up. Yeah. A mic down the front, please.
Logistics, always difficult.
I'm sorry, I think I robbed Paul Schulte out of microphone. Sorry about that. Łukasz Kulaza, Polish Institute of International Affairs. I would like to come back to the first part of the discussion when I heard a lot about Ukrainian victory, Russian defeat, and doing everything that we can to actually make it happen. But we're not doing everything that we can, right? And one of the logical conclusions to what I think most of you were talking about is to actually move to the next stage and commit troops and weapons to fight with the Ukrainians. As NATO, maybe not, but as a coalition of the willing, if indeed there is nothing to be worried when it comes to Russia because their nuclear intimidation is not credible, their armed forces are in retreat, then actually we are not risking that much. And if we want to win the war, indeed, then committing troops to Ukraine to fight with the Ukrainians seems like a logical choice. There's a question there, whether you agree or not. Thank you very much.
Malcolm, sure.
Okay.
Come on.
Look, I agree. We need to be doing a lot more, even within the constraints of what we're doing at the moment. You know, we should be sending ATACMS, we should be sending F-16s, we should be sending the Ukrainians everything they need to carry out a successful counteroffensive and to retake territory. In terms of going that next extra step, you know, one of the things I've been thinking about in regards to the F-16s is a flying tigers approach. So rather than a NATO intervention, volunteers, pilots flying F-16s. I don't know the legal implications of that, but we do need to think outside the box. And of course, if NATO does intervene on the ground, then we are in a different situation. We're in an escalatory environment. And you know, I disagree with the notion that somehow the Russian nuclear threats can be dismissed out of hand. I think that's dangerous because we simply don't know what Putin's thought processes are going to be if he's staring defeat in the face. But Elliot Cohen said it very well last night. We should not be constrained by the fear of him crossing the nuclear threshold. So there's a really fine balance there in terms of how do we go further, potentially risk that nuclear threat, but at the same time avoid being intimidated by it. And I don't have a good answer for that. Maybe someone else does. But we should not just dismiss it out of hand and say, oh, it's never going to happen. Because he does have nuclear weapons and, you know, they could very well use them. What we need to do is deter that use, and if he does use them, have a response that basically brings about war termination as swiftly as possible. But yes, at conventional level, we ought to be able to think outside the box and start thinking about what we can do beyond sending Ukraine additional weapons such as ATACMS and F-16s.
Lukasz, there are already personnel from certain NATO countries actively supporting, advising the Ukrainian forces. There have been 3 phases thus far of our support for Ukraine, our support being the coalition of countries supporting the Ukrainian armed forces. There is a further range of escalatory steps that could be taken given Russian escalation therein, before we would even consider deploying troops under NATO command into Ukraine. A phase 4 development involving a whole host of technical, intelligence, equipment contributions to strengthen the Ukrainian forces going forward. The danger for NATO at some point is that if it ends up being a coalition within the alliance that's consistently driving this port forward, over time, coalitions kill alliances. And we have to understand the implications for NATO for not being extremely clear of what the implications saying of our determination that Ukraine is restored to its 1991 borders. Because they have to understand there is a point at which this war reaches where we are willing to consider the risk of those very questions because we believe them to be fundamental to European security and defence and our security and defence. Now, if we're not willing to take risk, we're bluffing. And it's going to come down, I fear, like all these crises, is to who believes whose bluff. I believe the Russians have reached their culminating point. I believe that there are those inside the Frunze embankment who are extremely concerned about any talk of the use of nuclear weapons. I mean, my one appearance on Russian television during this process was in the form of a tweet, because I was watching 60 Minutes, and there was one of their dunderheads talking about nuking Britain because of our support for Ukraine and how long it would take a Russian nuke to hit Britain. To which I replied about the same time it would take a Trident II D5 to take out Moscow and St. Petersburg. Let's not go there. So I do think it ultimately comes down to, are we willing to back our stated war aims with a willingness to bear risk? If we're not, then I'm afraid the Russians will win, because it comes down to that.
If I may, I think that in between of what we are doing now and sending troops to NATO troops to Ukraine, we have a lot of possibilities that we should exhaust. And the first one is to get rid of self-imposed limitations to the military aid we are providing to Ukraine. And let's be honest, before the hopefully beginning spring counteroffensive of Ukraine, did the West provide Ukraine with enough weapons, enough equipment for Ukraine to succeed and to push out Russians out of occupied Ukrainian territories? Or do we bet on some kind of Ukrainian offensive going forward, but not to the extent Ukraine and we, the countries on the eastern flank, would wish for fear of escalation. So I do believe that between the current situation and sending troops to Ukraine, we have a lot of, we can still do much more. And first of all, get rid of fear of escalation, get rid of self-imposed limitations, and provide Ukraine with what it needs to push out Russian forces out of its territory.
I think we have defined what this war is. It's a Ukrainian war, it's defense against Russia, and the West is, and NATO is supporting Ukraine in its self-defense. And so there have been, rules have been established in this situation, and they have changed. I think every month or so, self-imposed limits have disappeared, but this is something where the West has wanted to explore the Russian reaction side, the quasi-annexation. It looked suddenly like they put parts of Ukraine under the Russian nuclear umbrella. And then, well, how serious has this been? We didn't know that, so we went, step by step, or the Ukrainians went step by step. And now there is a kind of limitation, which is not to attack Russian territory. But I just heard the German defense minister saying yesterday, of course, the Ukrainians shouldn't target civilian targets in Russia, but military facilities is legitimate, and it's according to the rules of war, it's legitimate. So I think we are extending the range of things that are possible under the headline supporting Ukraine in its self-defense. And if we would bring in NATO troops, this would completely change the nature of this war. It would be just a very different war. It wouldn't play out just in Ukraine. And I think nobody wants to go to war in the West. I think this is, and so of course, if Russia had no nukes, maybe it would look very different. But I mean, it's just a nuclear world where the nukes are defining the playground of international politics and conflict. And so I think this question is it's quite out of question, I would say.
Let's be clear, our support of Ukraine is legitimate under Article 51 of the UN Charter. It's not Article 5 of NATO, it's Article 51, which, frankly, the Chinese have signed up as well. So it's not that we're being illegitimate in our support for Ukraine. It's entirely what the UN Charter was established to ensure.
Thank you. Oh, well, we have a bunch of questions over here. Let's go to front row.
Thank you so much. My name is Justyna. I'm the member of the Ukrainian Parliament. Thank you so much for all the support that we've heard today. But my question would be, when I keep hearing the word escalation, especially when it comes to F-16 and ATACMS, and we are not asking to come fight our war. We don't need your boots on the ground, honestly. We can do it ourselves, but we need your weapons. And I remember at the beginning of the war, transferring MiGs from Poland was escalatory. Then receiving HIMARS was escalatory. Then the Patriots, everybody was telling us, forget about this word. And the next step was the tank coalition. And nobody wanted to do that because he would start the nuclear war. Now you're telling us that the F-16 or ATACMS might be an escalation. Can you please tell us what has changed with the other type of weapons that you think now that this is escalatory and the HIMARS or the tanks were not? And what we should be doing to actually receive the F-16, because I think it is clear for everyone in this room that we cannot win the war without the air superiority. Thank you.
Please.
I think you saw a very important meeting at Chequers between your president and my prime minister this week with the creation of the Jet Coalition. I think that's the first step towards, shall we say, giving you the air defense capabilities that you will require. I don't think we need to focus on specific systems. We need to focus on the effects you need to generate in the field to prevail. And those effects include adequate air defense. At some point, that will, to my mind, include fast jets, now whether it's F-16s or whatever. But then you come across a particularly European problem, is that most of our air forces have been cut over the last 20 years. And to give you fast jets will be a very major commitment for air forces already under pressure. I mean, I take the Dutch with their F-16s. If they give you some Dutch F-16s, the Dutch haven't got any left. That's the essential message. The other thing that worries me, and there are people in this room with far more knowledge about this than me, I see you being provided with all these different systems and platforms from all these different countries, all requiring different logistical tails, different maintenance requirements, different. I would like to see, probably in Poland, a NATO maintenance hub to support all those systems that we're giving you, so that we take that pressure off you and ensure that you are the teeth, that we establish a strong tail that can ensure you maintain operational effectiveness. But what I'm impressed by with the coalition is the shared appreciation of a picture of your battle space and what you require to prevail, and a willingness to go over those red lines to give you that kit. So the precedent has now been established where you will be reinforced. How far that goes, well, that's open to negotiation and, frankly, our defense budgets. But the precedent that we will give you what you need has clearly been established.
Yeah, look, I think you should get everything you need, simple as that. And I think what we need to do is get past this fear of escalation, this fear that the fact that the Russians could use nuclear weapons. I'm not saying, as I said, I disagree with the notion that they would never do it, but we can't allow that implicit threat to stop us from supporting you. So I think everything that should be on the table to you as fast as possible. And I love the idea of a logistics hub in Poland. I think that's excellent. The ability to take some of the burden off you so that you're the tip of the spear and we're behind you, supporting you, the ability to use that is the way to go. So I think that the key point is getting political leaders to look past those Russian nuclear threats and that fear of escalation and say, if we want to avoid a much larger war down the track that probably would involve the use of nuclear weapons, because it would be an attack on NATO, we need to ensure that Ukraine wins now, rather than essentially sort of hoping for the best in the future.
I do believe we will cross next lines. and what has contributed to changing over time the Western strategy of sending military aid to Ukraine was Russia not escalating, Ukraine fighting, and thus the West gradually getting rid of own mental limitations. But in all, at the same time, the human resources of Ukraine are not unlimited. And the sad story of this strategy is that the West probably has not included this factor in its calculation to the full extent. And that might have implications for further capability of Ukraine to wage the war, and then put questions to the West of how to support Ukraine in the future.
Just wanted to address one issue, risk awareness, and what is the narrative and what is the strategy. I think there's still in many quarters in Western Europe and maybe the US is the idea that either we go in or we stay out. So it's our choice. It's not our war. And I often said in Germany, this is not charity for Ukraine, but there's a sense of, well, we give them what we don't need, or but then what do you need in Europe? Why do you have your military hardware? What for? It's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing, diminishing the Russian threat. But the thing is that people still think that they can, that they can either go into this risk, and then they go often for moral reasons because of Bucha, because what they saw, but they don't go into this risk for strategic reasons so much. Strategic reason would be Russia expanding, threatening, undermining the European peace order. So people in Western Europe often don't understand that it affects them, their security. It's not a moral issue, it's a moral issue as well, but it's also a security issue. And so they think, well, yes, poor Ukrainians, we need to help them, give them a little bit, but they don't think it's, well, poor us if we get attacked. I mean, in Poland and in Baltic countries, it's a totally different view. But so what we need, I think, to clarify is that it's a long-term threat. A Russia that is belligerent, a Russia that sees itself as an empire, a Russia that wants to conquer territory and thinks war is a way to get there, is the biggest security risk to Western Europe as well, because there will be one moment when you will be involved. So we need to think more about the long-term threat. That is a higher escalation, a much bigger war with Russia in Europe, and I think people don't understand that this is not, it's not a fantasy of think tankers. It's quite a possibility. This is where we are moving if Russia is not being stopped right now. And so the strategic case for help, for support, is rarely being made. It's rather that Zelensky is a good, he's a good speaker, we need to help the Ukrainians, but we should think about helping ourselves. And so this strategic case, I don't see much of it still in Western Europe.
Just for the record, President Putin, Mr. Patrushev Sr., General Shoigu and General Gerasimov, they think we're already in.
Great. I think, is that third row, fourth row? Right there with the gentleman with his hand up.
Thank you. Tomasz Smoraka, Polski Foundation. I've got a question, in regards to all you said about China and Taiwan, and especially that there is a link between Ukraine and East Asia and Taiwan. I wonder, how do you comment the words, the famous words of President Macron from the interview a couple of weeks ago, that, to put it simple, Taiwan is not our business, and European autonomy is about keeping trade with China regardless of tension between the US and the PRC. Just I would like to hear your comments. Thank you.
Look, if in the scenario where China has invaded Taiwan, and the US has decided to intervene in support of Taiwan, and thus called on its Indo-Pacific allies such as Australia and Japan to support it, which I think it's inconceivable that any government of the day in Canberra wouldn't support the US at that point. Seriously, can you see Europe trading with China as US and Japanese and Australian people are dying in a war? I don't see it. I see President Macron's strategic autonomy concept as baffling, because if we're talking about a major power war between the United States and China, between the US and its allies and China in the Indo-Pacific, I really cannot see any European government of the day in good conscience doing trade deals with China. It's just a nonsense. And I think that, to put it bluntly, Xi Jinping has played Macron like a fiddle. He's manipulated him, he's exploited his personality, and Macron has fallen for him. And, you know, P.T. Barnum said it, there's a sucker born every minute. I'm sorry. This strategic autonomy concept is a nonsense. It's really important for NATO and for Europe to work together with the United States and its Indo-Pacific allies to deter China from launching that war in the first place. Only if we stand together, only if we work together and present a united, resolved front will China think twice. The goal, the objective of Western democracy should be to send the message to Beijing such that when Xi Jinping gets out of bed each morning and brushes his teeth in the morning and looks in the mirror, he thinks, not today. That's what we should be doing.
Are you calling President Macron a sucker?
Well, yes, I said it, so there you go.
Yeah, I think Taiwan is very much our business, not because of China, but because of Russia. Because if deterrence in the Pacific and in Taiwan fails, then we will have a spillover to Europe. And Russia will seize this chance to not only further attack and subdue Ukraine, but try also to challenge security architecture in Europe and probably stage an aggression towards NATO members here on the eastern flank. And I think this is the worst case scenario that many people in the Baltic states, in Poland and in a wider region fear, that US that will be focused and concentrated in the Pacific in case of the war there will not be present in Europe. Europe might be divided. Russia might find or decide that it's a window of opportunity to attack. And I think, therefore, there is a clear link between Taiwan and Europe, and therefore Europe should do everything possible to uphold deterrence in the Pacific.
You know, l'autonomie stratégique, the Gaullist wet dream. After he made that speech, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's a very senior French politician. And I put this question to him. I said, why do you always have to make these things so anti-American? I mean, you know, why? Why do you have to kind of present this as somehow there's a kind of moral equivalency between the United States and China, given the United States' support and for Europe over the last 80 years? I said, if you presented an argument that said, in 2023, given the growing pressures on the United States, it is surely appropriate that Europeans took on more strategic responsibility. That meant building more capabilities, military capabilities, more capacity. That's entirely logical. Because if you really want strategic autonomy, it will only come as a function of relative military capability, not words. When we Europeans build up a sufficient capability, we will influence Washington. If you are, you know, was asked to advise on the integrated review a couple of years ago, the UK, you asked me the #1 objective of any British defence review. It is influencing Washington. That's it. Most important thing, have enough capability of the right kind across intelligence, across deployable forces, across et cetera, to have influence in Washington. The more we Europeans build, the more we will have influence in Washington and therefore begin to shape American security policy, which is actually what Macron wants. He just goes about it in a ridiculously ham-fisted way.
Wanted to address another aspect. I think it's not only Macron in Beijing, it's also Kishida in Kiev. We see a growing awareness in the Indo-Pacific and in Eastern Central Europe that Ukraine and Taiwan are linked, not only because Russia and China are linked, but because it's an issue of global order and the rights of small states exposed to pressure from big imperialist countries. So we see that more and more countries are looking forward to have closer relationship, European countries with Taiwan. I mean, Lithuania stands out in that regard, but also the new Czech president, Pavel. I think one of his first calls, I mean, he's really interested in building this relationship. And so we see more and more awareness that we have a similar problem and that Central Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific are very similar battlefields about the shape of the global order of the future. Those are the two theaters. And I find it very positive and interesting that inside these regions, people start to link up to each other. The Czechs are very active, as I said, the Lithuanians, and I hope there will be more of that because it's really a matter of principle and of international order. So, yeah, Macron was, I think, exercising, there was an exercise in self-damage. And I think also, for example, in Germany, this has further, brought home the point that France is not really the kind of leader we would hope to see at the moment, but I think it just confirmed points that we have already, seen before. And so there's now the G7 meeting in Japan, and they very much hope to get a statement where they bring Macron back in line. And we had a lot of communication coming out of Paris that, well, the French are serious in the Indo-Pacific, but let's see how this plays out.
Okay,
I don't think any of us are going to get an invitation to Bastille Day in Paris anytime soon.
No, I don't think so. We have time for one last question. Highest bidder in the center there.
Konstantin Agate, freelance journalist living in Vilnius. I would like to get the panel back for a sec to the NATO summit in Lithuania in July. It's clear that Ukraine will not get anything approaching a formal invitation to the alliance. This will be definitely seen in Moscow as this kind of moment of triumph and of weakness. What do you think should be done in Vilnius? What would be your advice? The question is to the whole of the panel.
Yes.
Thank you, Konstantin. Good question, as ever, my old friend. We should offer them what Brzezinski and Vershbow proposed in the Atlantic Council last week, a defense and deterrent partnership. But they won't, for the very reasons that you highlight. But that is the choice that we're faced with. We've made it perfectly clear on this panel what we think, and I've made it perfectly clear what I think Vilnius should seek to do, is make that kind of statement. But I think that the alliance would be damaging itself not to make that kind of commitment. And at some point, decisions will begin to be taken outside the alliance institutional framework by those powers who need to go further than those powers that do not. I will leave it at that.
I do agree. We will be partly disappointed from the Vilnius summit with regard to the language on Ukraine. There will be no membership action plan offered. But the language probably that the NATO Vilnius Summit declaration will open a path of further strengthening political and military relations with Ukraine. This language...
Sorry, what does that mean?
That means that there is not time for discussion on membership action plan, and that will be disappointing. But still, I think there will be an opening for having more substantial relations with Ukraine, such as Sweden and Finland had with NATO pre-accession in case of Finland. So I suppose we should head into this direction with the Vilnius Summit. As much as I would wish for MAP being given to Ukraine, but simply for political reasons, that will not be the case. But I see three areas where we should look closely, where NATO, after NATO Vilnius Summit, it's not only how NATO wants to shape relations with Ukraine, it's also the issue of regional defense planning, high readiness forces, and all the structural changes to collective defense posture that the panel with General Cavoli and Jacek talked about. Very important issues from the perspective of Eastern Flank, and the commitments along with a new defense investment pledge in Vilnius will be hugely important for the Eastern Flank to strengthen deterrence, to strengthen the defense within NATO, and how Moscow looks upon our efforts. One issue more, enhanced forward presence. I would expect that NATO decides for some additional steps to strengthen the posture that has been agreed upon at Madrid. So I think these three issues that are important and will be important in Vilnius: collective defense, structural changes, enhancing forward presence, NATO-Ukraine relations, and also Sweden finally joining the alliance.
Great, thank you. I think very briefly, we're about out of time.
Look, I think it would be a missed opportunity if they're not given that offer of membership, but clearly, as you say, that's the political reality. So I think it's an opportune time to essentially provide a commitment to, or at least announce a shipment of ATACMS and F-16s to make that alternative commitment, and also to start negotiations with Ukraine about NATO membership, even if we can't open up the possibility of membership immediately, but make an in-principle commitment that we are going to talk about Ukrainian membership, rather than see it essentially as never an option to come on the table.
Great, thank you. I wanted to thank our panelists and the audience. I think we're now between them and lunch, but thank you so much.